I speak to you now in a voice meant only for those who dare to listen, for this secret was never meant to see the light of day. And yet here we are on the precipice of something that will change you forever. In the first 8 seconds, imagine a stillness so profound you hear nothing but a distant, strange ticking, as if time itself hesitates sand. Then a guttural whisper. They were taken in the same hour, the same dying breath, every year. That whisper is your invitation into the abysser, chilling truth, born in 1817 on the barren plains of Nebraska, where 5 brothers died within the same hour, the same day, every single year. You feel the weight of that sentence like a bone pressed against your spine, because it is not just history, it is a pattern, a code concealed by time, hidden from the archives, buried beneath layers of polite forgetfulness, institutional silence, church records erased, diaries burned. No outsider speaks of them. No grave marker stands to commemorate their names. They vanish each November day into darkness. But you were chosen. These are forbidden facts, suppressed by society's need for tidy stories, yet they pulse with a malevolent precision you must follow. These deaths were not natural. There are no documented epidemics in Nebraska in 1817. No storms, no famine, no recorded accident. 5 brothers born over successive years die within that same dreaded hour every year for generations. Father to son's son, the pattern continues until one eventually resists. One eventual brother who fails to die yet disappears himself as if consumed by the truth. There are rumors, secret lodges, ancient blood oaths, occult experiments tied to arcane rituals intended to grant immortality at a terrible cost. You will descend deeper. Each piece of evidence is a step farther from light and deeper into rot. Institutional records refuse to name them properly, ledger entries scrubbed, vital records overwritten with innocuous code. Nebraska, infant mortality, 1817. Rural family hazard, cause unknown, and yet in a private letter discovered in 1970 by a scholar who died in a car accident before he could publish. There was a line, they return each year to claim what they were promised. That phrase, whispered only once to a ghost, is your guide. The promise, the return, the claim. Now you stand at the edge of that promise. You will proceed. Justice will not protect you. History will not comfort you. But you stand. Ready to know, the official story is silence, and silence is the loudest lie. The 5 brothers of the Lawn family, though the name itself has been altered and concealed in every public record, were born between 1798 and 1806. Raised on a windswept farmstead 20 miles west of what would one day be Lincoln, Nebraska. Their father, Elias, was a man who kept to himself, a veteran of a war no one fully understood, his discharge papers sealed in an army chest that never left his bedroom. Locals claimed he had eyes that didn't blink and a habit of speaking under his breath as if conversing with someone invisible. His wife, Miriam, was said to have been taken in from a religious colony that vanished in 1795. A place rumored to mix the teachings of Scripture with rites older than the written word. The boys Isaac, Daniel, Jonah, Thomas, and Caleb were raised in a home that outsiders described as without sound, except for the constant ticking of a long case clock in the parlor. A clock that did not keep time like other clocks. A clock that, according to a traveling preacher, counted life, not hours. The first death came on November 12, 1817. Isaac, aged 19, collapsed in the barn at precisely 3:01 in the afternoon. The coroner found no sign of injury, no sign of illness, only a look of frozen terror, as though he'd seen something no human mind could bear. 1 year later, to the hour, Daniel fell dead in the same spot. Jonah followed the next year, then Thomas, then Caleb, each on November 12th, each at exactly 3:01 p.m., each body found with eyes wide and skin cold, as though death had been waiting patiently for its appointment. Witnesses reported a strange change in the air moments before the deaths, a heaviness, a stillness, birds halting mid-flight. Elias never spoke of it. Miriam wept without sound, her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps recitation of something far older. And yet, despite the impossibility of this repetition, the county records show only a bland cause, sudden cessation. Over the years, neighbors spoke less and less of the lawns. By the turn of the century, the family land was abandoned, the farmhouse collapsing in on itself, the long case clock gone. But those who walk the property today claim they hear a ticking under the soil, and sometimes, at exactly 3:01 p.m., they feel the ground pulse, as if counting down to something yet to come. You must understand, patterns like this do not happen in nature, and when they do, it is because something older than law, older than scripture, is keeping count. In 1823, 6 years after the last brother fell, a county surveyor named Matthew Orr was sent to appraise the abandoned lawn property. His journal, later recovered from his grandson's attic, describes the land as quiet to the point of suffocation and the air as cold, though the sun burned hot. Orr's horse refused to cross the property line, so he entered alone, boots sinking into soil that felt soft, almost sponge-like, as if breathing beneath him. The farmhouse stood in ruin, its roof caved in, windows shattered, yet the parlor was intact, and there, in the center, stood the long case clock, upright, unbroken, ticking steadily at an unnatural pace. He noted something strange. The hands did not mark hours, but instead bore numbers from 1 to 5. Each hand pointing not to a time, but to a name carved crudely into the wood beneath the glass. Isaac, Daniel, Jonah, Thomas, Caleb, or wrote that as he approached, the clock slowed, the ticking deepening into something almost like a heartbeat. When his fingers brushed the glass, a sharp crack echoed through the house, though no glass broke. He fled without completing his survey. That evening, at precisely 3:01 p.m., Orr's youngest son, miles away in another county, collapsed and died. No cause was ever found. The clock, according to Orr's notes, was gone when he returned days later. No one admitted to removing it. The county sealed the property and declared it unsafe, but that did not stop whispers. People claimed the Lawn family deaths were the result of a covenant gone wrong, a bargain between Elias and something that was not entirely human. The theory was that each son's life was payment for something promised long before their birth, and that payment had to be made with absolute precision to the hour. There were mutterings about an hour of binding, a moment when the veil between the living and the dead door, something worse, grew thin enough for debts to be collected. And if that is true, then you must ask yourself, what kind of man agrees to pay such a debt with the blood of his children, and why? Worse still, what if that debt was never truly paid, only delayed, still waiting, still counting? By 1831, the Lawn Farm had become a place people crossed themselves before passing, a scar on the Nebraska prairie. Travelers told of seeing faint lights moving across the property at night, not lanterns, but something dimmer, more deliberate, like willow wisps tracing invisible patterns in the grass. Cattle driven past the land would panic, sometimes breaking bones to escape the fence line. It was during this time the Reverend Silas Worth, a firebrand preacher from the East, arrived in the territory. He'd heard of the Lawn Brothers' curse, and saw in it either a moral lesson or a chance for spectacle. Worth gathered a small group of locals and staged a midnight cleansing ritual on the property, armed with nothing but Bibles, hymnals, and oil lamps. According to the only surviving account, written by a blacksmith named Ewan Priester, ritual began with scripture, but quickly dissolved into chaos. As Worth prayed over the remains of the parlor, the air turned thick, suffocating, as though the room had sunk beneath a river. Price claimed the lamps dimmed to red embers, and a sound began, not a ticking, but a deep, steady knock, like something on the other side of a wall. The knocking grew louder, irregular, frantic. One of the men screamed that he could see faces in the dark, pressed against some unseen barrier. Worth's voice faltered, replaced by a raw, choking gasp, and then at exactly 3:01 a.m. every lamp went out. When light finally returned, Worth was gone. No trace, no footprints, just the long case clock, now sitting in the middle of the dirt floor, its hands fixed on the name Elias carved at the center. The group fled and never spoke publicly of what they'd seen, but privately they warned others that the clock wasn't just marking death's, it was marking ownership, as if each name represented something claimed and held. Rumors spread that the clock had been seen elsewhere, in private estates, in the back rooms of county courthouses, in the possession of men who died suddenly and without reason. Yet every time someone tried to track it, the trail went cold, witnesses retracting their statements or vanishing entirely. Whatever kept the clock moving, whatever force it served, it did not like to be followed. And still, each November, at exactly 3:01 p.m., 5 sharp ticks echo somewhere on the plains, heard only by those fated to be next. The year 1844 brought the first documented attempt by an outsider to purchase the Lawn land. A wealthy fur trader named Nathaniel Creed recently returned from years dealing in the upper Missouri territories, saw in the abandoned acreage an opportunity for expansion. But Creed was not a fool. He knew the stories. His plan was not to farm the land, but to fence it, keep it untouched, and rent its mystique to traveling showmen eager to sell ghost stories for coin. For months he negotiated with the county, which refused to process the sale without an inspection. That inspection fell to a man named Elias Carter, no relation to the Lawns, who was known for his stubborn refusal to be frightened. Carter entered the property at noon on August 3rd with a hired hand, a teenager named Aaron Mills. By 12:45, Mills had fled back to town alone, pale and shaking, unable to speak for hours. When he did, the boy told of walking the old fields, finding them littered with bones, not human, but something in between. Some were as small as fingers, others as long as a man's forearm, curved unnaturally, with hollow channels that hummed when held to the ear. Carter, he said, had picked one up and remarked on the vibration, when the sound of ticking began all around them, not from a single point, but from the earth itself, as if hundreds of unseen clocks lay buried just beneath their boots. The boy ran. Carter never returned. His body was never found. Creed abandoned his purchase, moving east within the month. And yet, in September of that year, a letter arrived at the county clerk's office, bearing Creed's seal, but written in a hand no one recognized. It contained only one sentence: November will take 5. That November, in towns scattered up to 40 miles from the Lawn property, 5 unrelated men collapsed and died at 3:01 p.m., their faces locked in expressions of shock identical to those of the brothers decades earlier. Each man, investigators later found, had either walked past the lawn property or spoken of visiting it in the months before. The implication was clear: the curse, or whatever bound itself to that land, was no longer confined to the bloodline. It was expanding, marking new names for the clock to claim. By 1852, the lawn land had become more than a local superstition. It was a point of quiet fascination for certain men in positions of power. The Nebraska Territorial Assembly received an unsigned proposal suggesting the property be placed under federal observation for reasons of astronomical and metaphysical significance. The language was deliberately vague, but one passage stood out. The site exhibits punctual anomalies in mortality that suggest an unrecorded celestial influence, bound to an annual axis of 3 hours past midday. The proposal was dismissed. Publicly, but privately, Territorial Surveyor James Winthrop was ordered to map the property in detail. Winthrop's map survives only as a single, charred fragment. But in his private notes, smuggled out by his niece, decades later, he describes finding concentric patterns in the soil, rings of growth and decay that expanded and contracted with the seasons in ways that defied nature. In the center of these rings, the earth was blackened, but not by fire. It was as if something had leached the life from the ground, leaving it cold even in summer. Winthrop also recorded an incident on November 12, 1852, when he returned to observe the site at 3:01 p.m. He claimed the sunlight dimmed to a copper hue, and the shadows of the surrounding cottonwoods twisted as though bending toward the blackened center. In that moment, he heard the ticking not with his ears, but inside his chest, in perfect rhythm with his own heartbeat. When the sound stopped, he realized he had been standing there for exactly 1 minute, though his watch claimed an hour had passed. Days later, Winthrop's assistant was found dead in his home, slumped over a desk on which he had written the names Isaac, Daniel, Jonah, Thomas, Caleb in perfect, evenly spaced lines, exactly 5 times over. No one in the family knew the name's significance. After this, Winthrop destroyed most of his notes and left the territory without explanation. Yet in Washington, whispers began to circulate of Nebraska's Black Hour, a phrase used by a small group of military and political men who believed the land was not cursed in the religious sense, but was instead a fixed pointer kind of annual aperture. Something outside human time reached in to collect what was owed. And if that was true, then the deaths were not the mystery. The real question was, who or what was keeping count? In 1860, a physician named Dr. Horace Keene traveled from St. Louis to investigate the property under the guise of studying environmental causes of rural mortality. In truth, Keene was part of a loosely connected circle of men fascinated by unexplained death patterns, men who traded letters under pseudonyms and referred to themselves only as the Registry. Keene lodged in a small town 8 miles from the lawn land and began interviewing the oldest residents, piecing together fragments of stories that had been deliberately thinned out over decades. He learned of the clock, of the 5 names, of the repeated hour, but also of something darker. Witnesses claimed that in the weeks before each November 12th death, the victim would begin speaking to someone unseen. These conversations always took place alone, late at night, often outside, near open ground. One widow recalled waking to find her husband standing in their field, head cocked, nodding as though receiving instructions. Another claimed her brother had become obsessed with the number 5, arranging tools, books, and even meals into groups of 5 without realizing it. Keene took note, and in early November, he camped just inside the property line, determined to witness the phenomenon himself. For several nights, nothing happened. Then, on November 11th, just after midnight, he awoke to find a man standing 30 feet from his tent. The figure's face was indistinct, blurred as though hidden behind a pane of rippling glass. But its hands were visibly long, thin, and unnaturally still. Keene called out, but the figure made no sound, only lifted one finger to its lips in a gesture of silence before fading into the dark. The next day, at exactly 3:01 p.m., a farmer in the next township collapsed and died. Keene wrote that in that precise moment, he felt the ground beneath him flex, as though breathing in. He left the property that evening but continued his research in secret. His final letter to the registry contained a single sentence: "It is not the land that is cursed, but the hour itself, and the hour will travel." Keene vanished in early 1861, leaving behind a locked trunk. When it was opened decades later, it contained only a metronome, its pendulum frozen at a count of 5, by the winter of 1868. The lawn mystery had become a quiet obsession for a handful of journalists in the expanding Nebraska territory, men drawn not to superstition but to the possibility that something tangible, something provably beneath the stories. One of them, Charles Fenwick, a correspondent for the Missouri Ledger, was the first to connect the lawn deaths to an older pattern. While reviewing archival church records from the vanished colony Miriam Lawn had once belonged to, Fenwick found a disturbing entry from 1762, at the 5th hour of the 5th day in the 5th month. The chosen are taken, as was agreed. The handwriting matched entries for weddings, baptisms, and death sect. The word chosen was capitalized, the ink darker, as though pressed into the page. Fenwick traced this entry to 5 other events over the next 50 years, each involving the sudden death of exactly 5 individuals at the same recorded hour. In every case, the deaths were followed by a significant gain for a single person or family, land inheritance, elevation in political rank, sudden debt forgiveness. The implication was grotesque that lives were being exchanged like currency in a transaction no one dared admit was real. Fenwick's digging did not go unnoticed. In March 1869, he received a letter without signature or return address. It contained only one sentence, written in red ink: "Stop looking, or you will be one of them." Fenwick published nothing. Instead, he traveled alone to the lawn property on November 12th, determined to see the hour himself. His last journal entry describes standing in the blackened center of the land as the minute hand of his watch approached 3:01 p.m. The light bent as if the sky had drawn in a deep breath. My bones felt counted, weighed. What happened next is unknown, because Fenwick was never seen again. His horse was found tethered to a fence post a mile from the property, its eyes wide, foam on its muzzle. A week later, his landlady received a package containing his notebook, every page after that final entry torn out, and an object wrapped in cloth, a brass-clocked hand engraved with the name Charles. It was perfectly balanced, its tip worn smooth, as though it had been turning for a very, very long time. In 1875, the clock surfaced again, not in Nebraska, but in the parlor of a banking magnate's estate in St. Paul, Minnesota. The man's name was Silas Rourke, a figure known for his meteoric rise in wealth during a decade when most investors were ruined by market collapses. Rourke held extravagant gatherings for a select circle of businessmen, politicians, and judges. Guests later whispered that the gatherings always occurred in early November, and that at precisely 3:01 p.m. during the afternoon tea, Rourke would pause the conversation, stand, and wind the tall clock in the corner of the room, a clock with no numbers, only 5 brass hands, each engraved with a different name. One of those names was Caleb, another Jonah. A guest, a judge's aide, who later spoke anonymously, described how, on the day of the winding, Rourke would excuse himself at exactly 2:55 p.m., enter the parlor alone, and remain there until 3:02 p.m. When he emerged, he appeared invigorated, almost younger. And within hours, word would spread through the city that someone known to Rourke had died suddenly, far from the estate, without cause. In November of that year, the aide claimed to have peeked through the parlor's side door and seen the clock's hands turning of their own accord, each one slowly aligning to a central point before snapping back outward in unison as the clock emitted 5 sharp, unnatural ticks. After that, he swore, a shadow passed across the room, though the curtains were drawn against the sun. The aide left Rourke's employment the following week. By spring, he was dead found in his bed with eyes wide open, skin cold, a look of startled recognition frozen on his face. Rourke himself prospered until 1880, when, during his November gathering, he failed to emerge from the parlor. His guests found him slumped in the chair beside the clock, his hand still gripping the winding key. The clock was gone. Every door and window was locked from the inside. No signs of entry, no signs of exit. In its place on the floor was a small circle of blackened wood, perfectly smooth to the touch, as if something hot and precise had been there long enough to burn a mark into the living grain. That burn mark, witnesses swore, smelled faintly of iron and rain by 1887. The lorn legend had shifted from whispered superstition to a calculated pursuit for a certain breed of collector-men who trafficked in relics tied to death. Men who believed such objects could be used as instruments of power. One such man was Edgar Vail, a railroad tycoon whose fortune was matched only by his appetite for the macabre. Vail purchased a series of artifacts through intermediaries in Chicago. A cracked mirror said to show faces not present in the room. A set of brass keys that opened no known locks. And, most important to him, long case clock rumored to have no hour markers, only 5 brass hands inscribed with names. The seller claimed it had been in transit for decades, always passing to a new owner in November, always shortly before the sudden, unexplained death of 5 individuals. Vail installed it in a private study within his Omaha mansion, where entry was forbidden to all but himself. His staff noted that he began wearing gloves at all times, even indoors, and that his once booming voice had grown hushed, as if saving it for some private audience. In the autumn of that year, Vail invited 5 prominent rivals to his home for a business dinner on November 12th. None of those men lived to see November 13th. The official reports varied heart failure, stroke, sudden seizure, but all died. Between 3 o'clock and 3:02 p.m., neighbors swore they heard the faint chime of a clock during that minute, even from across the street. Vail's empire grew unchecked for 3 more years, until November 12, 1890, when his butler found him dead at his desk, his gloved hand resting on the winding key, his face twisted in a look of pure disbelief. The clock was missing. In its place stood a small brass plate, cool to the touch despite the roaring fireplace, engraved with a single word, taken, That plate, wrapped in oilcloth, was sent anonymously to the Nebraska State Historical Society, where it remains locked in a vault, accessible only by written petition. And yet, those who have handled it speak of a faint vibration, like a heartbeat, felt in the fingertips. Some claim it grows stronger in early November, peaking without fail at exactly 3:01 p.m. The turn of the century brought with it a new kind of curiosity, scientific, methodical, but no less dangerous. In 1902, Professor Albert Hallow, an investigator of temporal phenomena from the University of Chicago, petitioned for permission to study the Lawnland and any surviving artifacts linked to it. His colleagues mocked him, calling the clock a rural ghost story, but Hallow was undeterred. He secured temporary access to the blackened acreage, bringing with him 2 assistants, a camera, and an experimental device of his own designer copper and quartz apparatus, intended to detect fluctuations in what he termed chronometric pressure. The first 2 days yielded nothing unusual, but on the morning of November 12th, as the hands of his pocket watch crept toward the cursed hour, Hallow reported that his device began to click in an irregular pattern, faster and faster, until it was no longer clicks but a steady metallic hum. His assistants grew uneasy. The air itself seemed to vibrate. At exactly 3:01 p.m., the hum stopped and the camera, which had been aimed at the blackened center of the property, took a photograph without anyone touching the shutter. The plate, when developed, showed a tall, shadowed form standing where no one had been, its head tilted, its arms at its sides, and 5 faint glints where its hands should have been, as though made of brass. Hallow refused to speak of the image publicly, but privately confided to a colleague that the form acknowledged him before vanishing. That night, one of his assistants died in his sleep, his face twisted in the same look of startled recognition described in every lawn-related death. The second assistant resigned from academia entirely, vanishing from public record within a year. Hallow, shaken but relentless, began collecting testimonies from families who had lost loved ones at exactly 3:01 p.m. on November 12th, regardless of distance from Nebraska. He found cases in Pennsylvania, Texas, even London, each connected, however faintly, to someone who had been in possession of the clock or had visited the lawn property. His conclusion, recorded in a sealed journal, was damning. The hour is not fixed to a place, but to a ledger. The ledger has only 5 spaces per year, and the keeper never errs. In his final lecture, before disappearing in 1904, Hallow told his students one thing that was never transcribed into the official notes: if you ever hear ticking that does not match the time, run before the 5th beat. In 1911, the clock emerged once more, this time in the possession of a man who should never have crossed its path, a traveling photographer named Malcolm Greer. Greer specialized in memorial portraits, photographs taken of the recently deceased, a practice already fading from public favor but still requested in isolated rural towns. He had a knack for arriving just before tragedy struck, his studio wagon rolling in a day before a sudden, unexpected death. In the fall of that year, Greer was hired to photograph the body of a rancher's wife in Wyoming. When he arrived, witnesses claimed they saw him unloading not only his camera, but a tall, narrow crate, which he insisted remain unopened until the proper hour. That crate, as described later by a ranch hand, contained a long case clock of unnatural Desinitz brass, gleaming despite the dust, its pendulum swinging without weight. On November 12th, as the household gathered in mourning, Greer set the clock in the parlor beside the coffin. At 2:59 p.m., He told the family he would capture her final passing. Exactly at 3:01 p.m., he took the photograph. The plate revealed something none present had seen. 5 indistinct figures standing behind the coffin, each with elongated, gleaming hands, each with a face blurred beyond recognition. That night, 5 people from the household, including the widowed, suddenly, all within the same cursed minute, Greer vanished, leaving behind only his wagon and the clock. The wagon was found abandoned on a road leading east, its doors swinging open in the wind, the camera smashed to pieces. The clock, however, was gone again. Weeks later, in a pawnshop ledger from Omaha, there appeared a brief, cryptic entry: tall clock, no numbers. 5 hands taken, no sale. The shop owner died on the next November 12th. His death time recorded by the coroner as 3:01 p.m. exactly. What makes Greer's case particularly chilling is a set of undeveloped glass plates found in his wagon. When they were processed decades later, each plate showed the same image: an open field, the blackened center of the lawn property, and a shadowed figure holding a ledger. The ledger's pages appeared blank, except for one line written 5 times over: "You will be counted." By 1924, the legend of the lawn clock had become so intertwined with local history that it drew the attention of a writer named Samuel Dorrance, known for his serialized true crime features in Midwestern newspapers. Dorrance saw in the story not just a morbid curiosity, but a potential bestseller. He traveled to Nebraska that autumn, spending weeks combing through county archives, interviewing descendants of those who had lived near the property, and visiting towns where November 12th deaths had been recorded. His notes reveal a disturbing discovery. The clock was not merely present during each cluster of deaths, it had been delivered in advance, as if it traveled on an invisible route, finding its way to a host in time for the appointed hour. Dorrance began tracking this movement like a detective mapping a criminal's path, plotting locations on a wall map with red string. He noticed the route formed a spiral, tightening over decades toward the lawn land itself, as if something were drawing the clock home. Convinced he could intercept it, Dorrance rented a room in a farmhouse just 2 miles from the blackened property. On the morning of November 12th, the farmer's wife reported seeing a covered wagon on the horizon, moving unnaturally slow, as if each hoofbeat fell in rhythm with a deep, deliberate ticking. By mid-afternoon, the wagon had not arrived, but at exactly 3:01 p.m., the farmer collapsed at his table, dead before he hit the floor. Dorrance's last journal entry, written moments before, describes hearing the ticking grow louder, closer, though no wagon was in sight. "It is circling the property," he wrote, "not looking for me, waiting for me to acknowledge it." That night, Dorrance vanished from his rented room, leaving behind all his belongings except the wall map. On it, the spiral had been completed, with a final loop ending in a small brass emblem pinned to the lawn property's center. The emblem bore a single engraved word: Ledger. A week later, his editor received an unmarked package containing only a page torn from notebook. On it was scrawled, "The ledger has room for 5, but it can start a new page." For the next decade, the word ledger took on a chilling weight in the towns around the old lawn property. Children whispered it during dares, couples avoided it in conversation, and older residents would change the subject entirely if the topic arose. The idea was simple and horrifying. The clock was not merely a timekeeper, but a record keeper. Each November 12th, at exactly 3:01 p.m., it would balance its account by taking the lives it was owed away in multiples of 5. No one could say why it was 5, though some believed it tied to the original brothers, as if their simultaneous deaths had set a cosmic precedent. Others claimed it went further back, to a debt paid in blood to secure the land itself. In 1931, a Nebraska schoolteacher named Clara Pennington began her own investigation. She was a quiet woman in her 30s, known for her methodical note and precise handwriting. Clara believed the deaths were not random but connected through family lines, a hidden genealogy of debt. She traced the victims through birth records, marriage licenses, and old church registries, discovering that every single one could be linked, however distantly, to the 5 original brothers, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through blood. More disturbingly, she noticed that when a family line paid its 5, no further members died on November 12th, but when a line failed to complete its counsay, only 3 relatives were taken. The clock would return years later to claim the remainder. Clara called it the ledger's balance, and she began to predict, with terrifying accuracy, which families would be targeted next. Her work brought her unwanted attention. In the autumn of 1933, just weeks before the date, she wrote in her diary that she had been followed home by a man in a black overcoat who never spoke, only stood watching from across the street. That year, her predictions proved correct. 3 members of the Rayburn family were taken. The clock had not finished with them, she warned, but Clara never made her next list. On the morning of November 12th, her neighbors found her front door ajar, her home undisturbed, her diary open on the desk. The final entry read, "It is not just blood it wants, it is remembrance. And when no one remembers the names, the clock writes them for itself." At 3:01 p.m., the church bells in her town rang without being pulled. After Clara Pennington's disappearance, the clock became more than a superstition, became a curse people actively tried to outrun. Families with ties to the brothers. Bloodline began quietly leaving Nebraska in the months before November, scattering across the country in hopes of breaking the pattern. But running only seemed to make it worse. The deaths began to happen far from the old lawn property train. Derailments, factory accidents, sudden drownings, always with the same precision. 5 lives taken in the same hour, the same day. One survivor, a railroad worker named Frank Dalton, told reporters in 1936 that he had been scheduled to be on a train that derailed at exactly 3:01 p.m. on November 12th, killing 5 passengers instantly. "I wasn't there because my watch stopped that morning," he said, his voice shaking. "But when I got home, I heard it, just for a second, tick, tick, tick." Dalton swore the sound came from his own kitchen, though no clock was running. The idea that distance didn't matter was the final blow to those who had hoped to escape. It wasn't the land that was cursed, it was the name, and the name didn't need geography to find you. In 1940, an unassuming postman named Edward Willis tried to destroy the lawn clock itself. Armed with a sledgehammer and a flask of whiskey for courage, he broke into the now abandoned farmhouse one stormy night. Neighbors later reported seeing the windows glow faintly, as though lit from within by candlelight, even though the property had no power. Edward was never seen again. The next morning, however, the clock stood exactly where it had always stood, glass unbroken, pendulum swinging slow and steady. But now, in the center of its brass face, a new engraving had appeared beneath the Roman numerals. Edward Willis, 3:01. It was the first and only time the clock recorded a name in plain sight. That year, 5 people died on November 12th as always, but Edwards was not among them. The town whispered that the clock had kept him for itself. From then on, the fear deepened. No one touched it. No one went near it. And yet, every November 12th, as the minute hand crept toward its hour, the air seemed to still, as if the entire county was holding its breath for the ledger to turn another page. By the 1950s, the lawn clock was no longer a piece of furniture, was a wound in the town's history. People stopped marking November 12th on calendars altogether, as if ignoring the date could strip it of its power. But ignorance was a thin veil. Even outsiders could feel it. Travelers who stopped in the area during early November spoke of a pressure in the air, a strange heaviness that made their ears ring and their skin prickle. Some said it felt like being watched from every window, even the boarded-up ones. The pattern never faltered. 5 deaths, same hour, same day. Sometimes they were linked to the descendants of the original brothers. Other times they were complete strangers, yet somehow the names still appeared in the whispered ledger that only a few in town dared to keep. The ledger was not a book in the usual sense. It was a folded sheaf of yellowed papers, passed secretly between generations. No one knew who had started it, but each year the keeper would write down the names of the 5 who died. If you compared the entries across decades, a terrible symmetry appeared. Each new set of 5 corresponded in age, occupation, or circumstance to one of the brothers. A farmer in 1912 mirrored the eldest. A carpenter in 1927 matched the second. A mill worker, a teacher, a soldier, they repeated like clockwork, wearing new faces but dying in the same shape. By now, even the coroner refused to work on November 12th. He locked the office doors at noon, knowing that by the end of the day, his phone would ring exactly 5 times. Local churches tried to counter the fear by holding all-day prayer vigils, but those who attended claimed they sometimes heard faint tapping during the silent moments, like metal on wood, always in counts of 5. That year, 1953, something changed. The ledger keeper school librarian named Agnes Vance found her own name scribbled at the bottom of the coming November's page. She swore she hadn't written it, and the ink looked fresher than the others. Agnes fled the town that night, never telling anyone where she was going. But the next November 12th, at precisely 3:01 p.m., she was found dead in a hotel room in Denver, 500 miles away. The local police report noted a strange detail. On the bedside table sat a travel alarm clock. Its hands were frozen at exactly 3:01. By the late 1960s, the cursor, whatever it was, no longer respected borders. The 5 deaths still came on November 12th at 3:01 p.m. But now the victims were scattered across states, and sometimes even across countries. A postal worker in Kansas collapsed mid-route. A fisherman in Nova Scotia fell into calm water and never resurfaced. A shopkeeper in London was found slumped over his counter. A young woman in Mexico City died at her desk, and a retiree in Australia simply stopped breathing in his garden chair. All died within the same 60 seconds, their time zones aligning to the Nebraska hour. The news began to notice. International papers called it the Lorne Synchrony, though most articles avoided mentioning Nebraska directly, as if the town's name itself was a contagion. In Lorne, the ledger still tracked each victim. Whoever kept it now did so in complete secrecy, but somehow the pages still filled with perfect handwriting, always in the same deep brown ink, even when ballpoints had replaced fountain pens decades earlier. A handful of scientists tried to investigate, proposing everything from geomagnetic anomalies to a hidden contagion. But the moment they visited Lorne, they abandoned their work, refusing to comment publicly. One physicist, before retreating into silence, told a colleague that the town had a frequency not meant for human ears and that the sound of it followed him home, hidden in ticking clocks and dripping faucets. By the 1970s, some families began destroying every clock in their homes each November, hoping that without a timekeeper, death couldn't find them. It never worked. A man without a single watch or wall clock died in front of his television as a news anchor announced the time, 3:01, in 1977. An oddity shook the paterna. Sixth person died. This had never happened before. The extra victim was a boy named Caleb Marks, only 11 years old, who lived 50 miles from Lorne. No one could connect him to the brothers or their mirrors in the ledger. His death was so unexpected that for a moment, people hoped it meant the cycle had broken. But when the next year arrived, the 5 deaths returned as usual, and the ledger included Caleb's name under a strange, new heading: the spare. The appearance of the spare altered the town's dread in a subtle but irreversible way. Until Caleb's death, there had been a morbid precision to the curse 5 lives. 5 brothers' shadows, all aligned in an unchanging symmetry. Caleb's entry cracked that symmetry, and no one knew what it meant. Some feared it was a sign the curse was expanding, that the 5 were no longer the sole measure of the hour. Others whispered that the spare meant the curse was choosing substitutes, perhaps when one of the original bloodlines grew too weak. This fear deepened when, the following year, one of the usual 5 victims, an elderly man named Henry Sutter, died right on schedule, but so did his granddaughter, 23 Lydia, who had been in perfect health. The ledger, as always, recorded both deaths, this time with Lydia's name placed directly beneath her grandfather's, as if paired. The townspeople began to wonder if the curse was no longer limited to the hour it seemed to be learning, adapting. A farmer who had studied the ledger in secret claimed that the handwriting itself had changed since Caleb's entry, growing tighter, sharper, as though the ink were cutting into the paper. In 1981, the pattern warped again. That year, 2 of the 5 died in accidents that had been set in motion hours earlier, one in a slow-building house fire, another in a vehicle crash. Yet the coroner placed both official times of death at 3:01 p.m. The implication was chilling. The curse didn't have to strike instantaneously. It could orchestrate events, winding them toward its hour like a clockmaker setting gears. By now, Lorne had nearly emptied. Abandoned farmhouses leaned into the wind, their roofs sagging under decades of neglect. The few remaining residents lived like fugitives, even from each other, locking their doors not just against strangers but against the possibility of sharing too much. Yet still, every November 12th, at 3:01, the bells of St. Mark's rang not from the hands of any living person, but from within the empty steeple, as if the air itself kept the time. And when the sound faded, somewhere 5, sometimes 6, lives would end, and the ledger's pages would curl faintly at the edges, as though breathing. By the late 1980s, the ledger had become more than just a record. It was an object of fixation, even obsession, for those who dared remain in Lorne. The book no longer sat openly in the church. It was locked in a glass case in the old rectory, though somehow, without fail, each year a fresh page would be filled in the same looping, archaic script no one alive could mimic. No one saw the hand that wrote it, but the ink was always wet if you checked within minutes of the deaths. The surviving townsfolk treated it like a barometer, its latest entry dictating the emotional weather for the year ahead. Some swore that If you stared at a fresh name long enough, you could hear faint scratching sounds, as though the page itself was still being inscribed somewhere else in the dark. In 1987, a visiting folklorist named Dr. Helen Archer arrived with a theory that the curse wasn't about the brothers at all, but about the hour itself. She believed that whatever force took the five was tied to a fixed point in time, a wound in the calendar that could not heal. Her research led her to propose a dangerous test, to deliberately keep every person in town awake, alert and clustered together under observation for the entire day of November 12th, so that no one could die without witnesses. The remaining 11 residents agreed, seeing it as a desperate last chance to break the cycle. That year, they gathered in the school gymnasium with food, water, and medical monitors, watching the clock tick toward 3:01. At the exact minute, the gym's lights flickered and went black. In the pitch-dark silence that followed, there was no scream, no suddenly, the slow return of power. When the lights came on, 5 chairs were empty. No bodies, no trace. The missing were never found, but their names appeared in the ledger within the hour, the ink deep and almost carved in two. The paper. That experiment was the last attempt to resist the curse. Afterward, even the most stubborn families fled, leaving behind the windswept husks of homes and the church's locked door. Lawns ceased to exist on maps by the mid-1990s, its name erased from road signs, but the ledger's pages kept turning somewhere, as if the town's absence meant nothing to the hour. In the decades since Lorne's official disappearance, the story of the 5 brothers became an underground obsession for a certain kind of historian, the kind drawn to patterns no one else wanted to acknowledge. Some believed the curse migrated, traveling with the bloodlines of the vanished families, waiting to strike their descendants in far-off towns. There were whispers of clusters of 5 deaths always the same day, always the same hour, appearing in places with no obvious connection to Nebraska at all. A family reunion in Oregon where 5 cousins collapsed mid-toast. A fishing boat off the coast of Maine where 5 crewmen fell dead in silence while the others stood unharmed. Each time, the victims' names appeared, never announced, never explained in a privately circulated photograph of the ledger, as though someone still had access to it. Digital copies would surface on hidden forums, but the pages never looked scanned. They looked lit from within, the ink throwing tiny shadows against the parchment, as if the handwriting itself was raised and alive. Investigators who tried to trace the source of these images found only dead email addresses and shuttered P.O. boxes. One man claimed to have tracked a package back to a storage facility in Iowa, but when he opened the unit, it contained nothing but a single chair positioned beneath a bare bulbous light bulb burning at 3:01 sharp every day. The deeper one dug, the more the lines blurred between folklore, coincidence, and something deliberately orchestrated. And that's where the darkest theory took root, that the curse had never been supernatural at all, that the 5 brothers were only the first to be caught in an elaborate, generational act of ritual murder and inheritance of violence carried out by a network that valued secrecy over life. Whether those rituals fed something else, something inhuman, was a matter of interpretation. But one detail refused to vanish with time: the look on every victim's face, described in every surviving account. Not terror, not pain. A strange, almost knowing calm, as though they had seen something the rest of us are not meant to see, and in that final instant had agreed to go. By the late 20th century, the legend of the 5 brothers had fractured into competing versions, each more elaborate than the last, yet every one orbiting around the same immutable moment, the same day, the same hour, the same number, dead. A retired Nebraska coroner named Wallace Brigg claimed in an unpublished memoir that he had been sent, in 1964, to examine 5 bodies found in a barn outside a ghost town called Meriton's Hollow, a place so far off the map that it vanished from state records a year later. Briggs swore that the victims were all men in their 30s, all unrelated, but every single one bore an identical birthmark high on the left shoulder, perfect black ring the size of a wedding band. He said their cause of death could not be determined, though their hearts had stopped within seconds of one another. The local sheriff filed it under carbon monoxide poisoning, but Brigg insisted there was no fuel source, no fire, not even a heating system in the building. The detail that truly haunted him, though, wasn't the bodizit, was the clock. A large iron-faced wall clock, still ticking when he arrived, had frozen at exactly 3:01. He'd seen frozen clocks before in crime scenes, but this one resumed ticking again 3 days later, according to a deputy who had been ordered to store it in the evidence locker. Brigg left his job a year after the Meriton's Hollow case, citing profound psychological stress, and moved to a cabin in Wyoming where he lived out his days writing feverish letters to local papers warning about the hour. His words were ignored until the letters stopped, on according to the postmark August 14th, at 3:01 p.m. in the early 2000s. A Nebraska State University historian named Dr. Eliza Carrington began piecing together the scattered accounts, determined to separate fact from superstition. Her research uncovered a chilling pattern that no folklorist or journalist had ever fully connected. Not just 5 brothers in 1817, but clusters of 5 men, sometimes blood relatives, sometimes complete strangers, dying in precise synchrony every decade or so, always on the same date and hour. The earliest documented recurrence after the original tragedy was in 1837, when 5 railroad workers collapsed on a bridge construction site, their watches all stopping at exactly 3:01. In 1857, 5 men in a logging camp were found dead around a cold fire pit, their bodies arranged in a rough circle. Dr. Carrington traced these events through court records, parish death registries, and even private diaries, noting that in every single case, someone present at the scene claimed to have heard a faint, metallic ticking in the minutes before the deaths. What unsettled her most was that, in each decade's incident, one of the dead bore the surname Ashford. The Ashford family name was linked to the original 1817 brothers, yet its branches had scattered widely over the years, many members unaware of any shared ancestry. This suggested either an uncanny hereditary curse or a deliberate targeting that had persisted for nearly 2 centuries. Carrington's public lectures on the phenomenon drew modest local attention until she announced she had found a predictive marker for when the next synchronized deaths would occur. Her final lecture was scheduled for August 14, 2017. At precisely 3 p.m., witnesses said she began speaking to a packed auditorium, but at 3:01, her voice faltered. She collapsed mid-sentence along with 4 men in the audience. Every clock in the hall had stopped. News of the 2017 auditorium deaths spread quickly, but the official investigation seemed determined to choke the story before it could take root. The coroner's report listed sudden cardiac arrest for all 5 victims, despite their varying ages and apparent good health, and an internal memo leaked from the police department suggested that orders had come from above, to avoid any mention of synchronized timing. Independent journalists who pursued the lead found themselves stonewalled. Records vanished. Witnesses retracted statements, and one reporter's apartment was ransacked without anything of value stolen, save for her laptop. Yet a handful of details slipped through the cracks. A student who had been recording Dr. Carrington's lecture claimed that her microphone picked up a strange undercurrent just before she collapsed. A faint ticking that grew louder until it sounded almost like a slow heartbeat. Forensic audio specialists dismissed the claim, but the recording disappeared from university servers within hours of being uploaded. Among the conspiracy forums, the incident became known as the Ashford Minute, with theories ranging from government time experiments to an ancient curse bound to the number 5. What fueled the paranoia was an overlooked fact buried in a local obituary. One of the men who died that day had no connection to the university, no reason to be in the building at all except that his great-great-grandfather was the last surviving brother of the original Ashford 5. In the months following the 2017 incident, patterns began to emerge that hinted at something far more orchestrated than coincidence or curse. Amateur genealogists on online forums started cross-referencing death records, family trees, and census data, revealing that nearly every victim across the 2 centuries shared a single bloodline that could be traced, however distantly, to a woman named Margaret Ashford, mother of the original 5 brothers. Margaret herself was a historical ghost. Little was documented about her, except for whispers in parish records describing her as a keeper of the clock, a phrase that appeared in multiple handwritten accounts. One diary from 1816 mentioned her carrying a small brass timepiece that never required winding and struck 5 times when none could hear but her sons. Local legend claimed she made a bargain during a harsh winter, offering something precious in exchange for the survival of her children. When all 5 died on the same hour, some believed the debt had come due, but the genealogist's findings were even more unsettling. The bloodline was not narrowing with time, it was expanding. By 2020, thousands of living people unknowingly carried Ashford blood scattered across the world. If the deaths were following a strict temporal cycle, the next Ashford Minute would not claim just 5 victims, could claim hundreds, maybe thousands, all at the exact same second. And no one knew how to stop it, because the only person who might have understood the true nature of the clock had been dead for 200 years. By early 2021, the theory of an impending mass event had reached a small circle of private researchers, cryptographers, and fringe scientists who began referring to themselves as the horologists. They operated quietly, sharing findings only in encrypted forums and through hand-delivered documents, convinced that any digital trail would be intercepted. Among them was a reclusive horologist named Dr. Elias Brandt, who claimed to have located the original Ashford timepiece in a locked vault beneath a defunct bank in Omaha. According to Brandt's account, the clock was unlike any mechanism known to modern engineering. Its gears moved without mainspring or battery. Its face bore no numerals, only 5 equidistant marks, and its pendulum swung with a slow, deliberate precision that defied normal physics. Brandt said it was frozen at a single moment, 3 hours, 17 minutes, and 42 seconds, yet emitted a faint metallic heartbeat audible only when standing within arm's length. The horologists believed that the clock was both a record and a trigger, marking the exact moment the Ashford deaths occurred each cycle and somehow tethering those of the bloodline to it. Brandt argued that if they could dismantle the device before the next alignment, they might break the chain, but he also warned that the clock might not be mechanical at all, but an anchor for something older, something that had been keeping its appointment for over 2 centuries, and that destroying it could unleash something far worse than synchronized death. In March of 2021, Brandt and two other horologists and archivists named Lillian Cho and a former military engineer known only as Mercer made their move. They bypassed the vault's outdated security with alarming ease, finding the timepiece, exactly as Brandt had described, resting on a velvet pedestal in a glass case that bore no dust despite decades of disuse. Cho swore she saw condensation blooming on the inside of the glass as they approached, like the clock was breathing. Mercer, skeptical of any supernatural claim, smashed the case with a hammer, but the sound it made was wrong too deep, almost subterranean. The instant the hammer struck, the clock's pendulum began to swing, slow and smooth, ticking in perfect cadence with their own pulses. Brandt froze, his face going pale, whispering, "It's awake." The marks on the clock face began to glow faintly, one by one, each flare matched by an inexplicable drop in the room's temperature. Cho claimed she could hear voices under the ticking, indistinct but layered, like a crowd murmuring in a language she almost understood. Mercer wanted to smash it entirely, but Brandt shouted that doing so could collapse whatever boundary the device maintained. They argued in hushed, urgent tones, but the decision was made for them when the fifth mark ignited and the hands that had been frozen for centuries began moving toward the exact moment that had claimed the Ashford brothers in 1817. The temperature plummeted so quickly that frost began to crawl across the walls of the vault, each crystal forming in jagged, unnatural patterns that resembled branching veins. The air grew heavy, pressing against their chests, making every breath feel like inhaling cold smoke. Brandt's watch stopped, Cho's phone went black, and Mercer's flashlight flickered before dying completely, leaving the faint glow of the clock's markings as the only light. The ticking grew louder, not mechanically loud, but as if it were happening inside their skulls, matching their heartbeats until they couldn't tell which was which. Then came the sound of footsteps above them, slow and deliberate, though the building had been abandoned for decades. Cho's breath hitched. When she realized the steps were synchronized 5 steps, then silence, 5 steps again. Brandt muttered that it was too late, that the event had already been triggered. The clock's hands aligned perfectly at 3 hours, 17 minutes, and 42 seconds, and in that instant, all 3 were hit with a crushing sense of déjà vu, so strong it felt like drowning in memory faces. They didn't recognize deaths they had never seen, years flashing by like the rapid flip of a book's pages. When the moment passed, the vault was empty. The clock was still there, its pendulum still swinging, but Brandt, Cho, and Mercer were gone, leaving behind only 3 faintly glowing handprints on the glass case, each positioned exactly where they had stood. The official reports claimed the vault was never entered, that the interior showed no sign of disturbance beyond minor atmospheric condensation. But the night guard who filed the initial incident log never returned to work, and in a recorded interview obtained years later, he admitted to hearing what he called overlapping clocks, dozens of them ticking in chaotic unison, even though the room supposedly contained only one. He swore he also saw 5 shadows on the vault wall too tall, 3 shorter, none of which matched the people known to be in the building. In the weeks that followed, strange anomalies spread outward from the archive. Street lamps flickered in rhythmic bursts. Church bells rang at 3:17 a.m. across multiple towns without any human intervention. And on March 17th of the following year, 5 people in different states collapsed dead at the exact same second, their final expressions eerily peaceful, as though they had been waiting for it. Authorities dismissed the pattern as coincidence, but a handful of researchers, some tied to the same horology circles Brandt belonged to, recognized the intervals. It was happening again, the same timing, the same fixed date, just as it had in 1817. And those researchers whispered among themselves that the glowing marks on the clock were not merely decorative but countdowns, and that 3 more had yet to ignite by the second year after the vault incident. The glow on the clock's glass had spread, faint threads connecting the original handprints to newly forming shapes, as if more identities were being written into its surface. A private investigator named Halloran, who had been tracking the March 17th deaths for over a decade, managed to infiltrate the secured storage where the clock was now kept. He filmed everything, how the pendulum moved in a way that defied physics, swinging wider when no one breathed near it, slowing to almost a stop when he tried to measure its speed. The footage showed his breath fogging unnaturally in the warm room and the second hand twitching backwards in increments, as though counting down to something. Hours after leaving, Halloran was found in his apartment, seated at his desk, eyes open, his phone recording an audio file of his last minutes. On the tape, he mutters about hearing 5 voices speaking at once, and how they kept saying the same hour and minute, over and over, until his voice breaks into a strangled laugh that fades into silence. When police examined the file, they found 5 faint pulses in the background, perfectly spaced, exactly 3.17 seconds apart. In the months following Halloran's death, the government quietly transferred the clock to an undisclosed military facility, claiming it was part of an anomalous energy study. But leaks from within hinted at chaos time-stamped security footage that didn't match actual events. Corridors where guards swore they saw themselves walking past twice, and clocks on the wall that began running at slightly different speeds, diverging more each day. One anonymous technician reported that every March 17th, at precisely 3:17 a.m., the base's power would flicker, and 5 heart monitors in the infirmary would flatline simultaneously, even if no patients were connected. Attempts to dismantle the artifact failed. Drills snapped, acids left no mark, and high heat only made the glass brighter. A classified memo described a final phase approaching 5 concentric rings appearing faintly on the dial, each filling with an almost imperceptible red light. The rings were expected to complete within 5 years, but calculations showed the last one would align exactly at 3:17 a.m. on March 17th, the same date the 5 brothers died 2 centuries ago. What no one could explain was why, in the reflection of the clock's glass, the room always appeared empty, even when they were standing right in front of it, as March 17th approached again. A storm, unlike any recorded, began to form over Nebraska's static heavy clouds, spiraling without wind, their lightning silent but blinding. Satellite images showed a perfect circle of turbulence centered exactly where the brothers' original homestead once stood. Meanwhile, inside the facility, surveillance teams reported the clock's rings had stopped glowing separately and were now rotating like gears, grinding out a low metallic hum that resonated in the walls and in their teeth. Some guards began bleeding from the nose and ears, claiming they could hear 5 sets of footsteps pacing in unison down the empty corridors. The head researcher, Dr. Kepler, submitted his last report in a sealed envelope labeled to be opened if we don't survive, warning that the clock was not measuring time, it was feeding on it, stockpiling hours, minutes, and seconds until the appointed moment. On March 16th, the night before the anniversary, every timekeeping device in the building froze at 3 hours, 16 minutes, and 59 seconds. Cameras caught the staff standing motionless, eyes open, bodies swaying slightly as though listening to something. The feed went black at 3:17 exactly, and when it returned, the facility was empty. Every door stood wide open. The clock was gone. The next morning, residents of a nearby town reported seeing 5 men walking down the main street barefoot, wearing clothes soaked in mud that looked 2 centuries old. They moved in perfect sync, their faces pale but expressionless, each carrying a shard of black glass that seemed to absorb the sunlight around it. Witnesses said they didn't speak or blink, only stopped at the old church to stand in a circle around the bell tower, which began ringing on its own. The sound was rung too deep, too slow, like it was striking minutes instead of seconds. Hours later, livestock were found dead in their fields, their bodies untouched but eyes wide open as if frozen in shock. Security teams combed the area, but every photo taken of the 5 figures came back blank, the frame showing only empty streets. That night, at precisely 3:17 a.m., across the entire state, every person awake reported the same sensation, a sudden, bone-deep certainty that they had lost exactly 1 year of their lives. By dawn, historians and archivists began reporting that records, photographs, and census data connected to the 5 brothers were vanishing, not just from databases, but from physical archives, as if the paper itself had never been printed. Families who had once claimed descent from the brothers now denied any connection, genuinely unable to recall the names. The land where the homestead had stood was now listed as unregistered, and satellite images showed nothing but a patch of scorched, glassy soil that reflected no light at night. Dr. Kepler's sealed letter was recovered from a locked safe in an abandoned federal office 2 states away. In it, he wrote that the brothers had been bound to the same hour and same day not by coincidence, but by a pact in exchange to preserve their lives during a famine in 1817, with payment due in exact increments of time. The letter ended abruptly, with one final line: "The debt is not settled. They are only collecting." If you found this story chilling and thought-provoking, make sure to like this video, share it with others who love dark history, and subscribe to History's Dark Mirror, so you never miss the next forbidden tale.